The last thing I expected on a Tuesday morning in March was to watch my own mother raise her right hand, look directly at the judge, and swear to tell the whole truth, right before she told a courtroom full of strangers that I was unfit to raise my son. I was sitting 8 feet away from her. She didn't look at me once. My name is Claire Alderton. I'm 34 years old, and for 6 months of my life, I was legally permitted to spend 1 hour per week with my own child, supervised, monitored, and documented, because the 2 people who raised me decided that helping my ex-husband take my son was more important than the truth. This is the story of how they nearly succeeded, and how a 9-year-old boy with an old iPad changed everything. Before I tell you what's in that video, I need you to understand something. What happened to me didn't start in a courtroom. It started the way most family betrayals do, slowly, quietly, in the ordinary spaces between Sunday dinners and phone calls, long before anyone filed a single document. If this story is already hitting something in your chest, hit the like button, and subscribe if you want to hear what happened when that judge called an emergency hearing. Because I promise you, the look on my ex-husband's face that day is something I will never forget for as long as I live. Now let me take you back to where this really began. I met Daniel Alderton when I was 26. He was charming in the specific way that takes years to recognize as performance, the kind of man who makes everyone in the room feel like the most important person there, until the room empties and it's just you. And suddenly you're not sure if he ever really saw you at all. We got married when I was 28. My parents loved him. That's the part I need you to understand before anything else. My father, Robert, shook Daniel's hand at our engagement dinner and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Finally, a man with a plan." My mother, Patricia, started calling him my son before we'd even set a wedding date. I told myself it was sweet. I should have understood what it meant. Our son, Elliot, was born 11 months after the wedding. He came out with Daniel's dark eyes and my stubborn jaw and a cry that rattled the hospital windows. I remember holding him in that delivery room, counting his fingers and feeling something settle inside me. Something solid and permanent that I didn't know I'd been missing. Daniel held Elliot for approximately 40 seconds, announced he looked just like Alderton, handed him back to the nurse, and asked if there was anywhere to get decent coffee in the hospital. That was 2016. It took me 3 more years to admit what I already knew. The marriage was wrong from the start. Not violently wrong, not dramatically wrong. The kind of wrong that accumulates in small daily deposits. Daniel controlled the money. Not obviously, not with cruelty, but with a practiced helplessness. He forgot to transfer funds. He questioned purchases. He mentioned the cost of things in a tone that made me feel perpetually indebted for existing in my own home. He traveled for work 4 days a week, and when he came home, he treated our house like a hotel he had mixed feelings about. Elliot and I were part of the furniture. By 2019, I had been quietly documenting things. Not because I was planning anything, I'm not that calculated, but because I had started to feel like I was losing my mind, and writing things down was the only way I could hold on to my own memory of events, dates, times, what was said, what wasn't. I didn't know yet how important that habit was going to become. I filed for divorce in January 2020. Elliot was 3 years old. I had a part-time job at an architectural firm, a joint bank account that Daniel emptied 4 days after I served him the papers, and a rented apartment I moved into with $600, and a boy who asked me every night for 2 weeks why Daddy wasn't coming to read his stories. What I didn't have, it turned out, was my parents. The first sign was a lunch that got canceled. My mother and I had a standing lunch, first Thursday of every month, the Italian place on Clement Street that she'd been going to since before I was born. She canceled in February 2020, 3 weeks after I filed. "Coming down with something," she said, then again in March. "Busy with your father's checkup." Then she stopped rescheduling altogether. I told myself it was the pandemic. Everything was the pandemic in 2020. By summer, Daniel had hired an attorney named Marcus Webb, a custody specialist with a reputation in our county that made my own lawyer go quiet for a moment when I said the name. Webb was expensive. Daniel was not a man with expensive taste. He was a man who understood the value of targeted investment. The custody arrangement we'd been operating under was informal. Elliot spent 3 nights a week with Daniel and 4 with me. Nobody was happy, but nobody was in court either. I wanted to formalize it. I thought formal was safer. I filed a motion to establish a permanent parenting plan in September 2020. 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb filed a counter motion on Daniel's behalf. It alleged that I was emotionally unstable, that I had a history of erratic behavior, that I had, on multiple occasions, created an environment that was harmful to Elliot's emotional development. It listed 2 witnesses who were prepared to testify to these facts, Robert and Patricia Harmon, my parents. I read their names on that document 3 times. My lawyer was talking. I couldn't hear her. There was a sound in my ears like water, like being held underwater. And I was reading my parents' names on a legal document filed against me by my ex-husband's attorney, and I was trying to understand how the world had rearranged itself so completely without my noticing. I called my mother that night. She picked up on the 4th ring. Claire. Her voice was careful, prepared. "Mom, I just saw the filing." Silence. "You're testifying for Daniel." "We're testifying for Elliot," she said. "There's a difference." There wasn't. There wasn't a difference at all, and she knew it, and I knew it, and the careful steadiness in her voice told me she had rehearsed this exact moment. My mother does not do things impulsively. When Patricia Harmon makes a decision, she has already considered every angle and closed every exit. "What did he tell you?" I asked. "What did Daniel tell you that made you think?" "This isn't about what anyone told us. This is about what we've seen." "What have you seen, Mom? Tell me specifically. What have you seen?" Another pause. Longer this time. "We've seen you struggling, sweetheart. We've seen you not coping. And Elliot needs stability." Sweetheart, she called me sweetheart while she was dismantling my life. I hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, and I stayed there until I heard Elliot call for me from his bedroom. And then I got up, washed my face, and went to read him his stories. That was the last time I cried for a long time. I decided that night that I couldn't afford to. The custody hearing was scheduled for November 2020, 8 weeks away. My lawyer, a woman named Sandra Yee, who had the calm, precise energy of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing, sat across from me in her office and laid it out plainly. "Your parents' testimony is going to hurt," she said. "A judge weighs grandparents heavily when they testify against a parent. It signals something systemic, something that goes beyond a difficult divorce. We need to prepare for that." What does preparing look like? Character witnesses, your own testimony, documentation of your involvement in Elliot's daily life, school records, medical appointments, his teachers. She paused. "And we need to understand what Daniel has given your parents. Something shifted them. People don't testify against their own children without a significant push." I thought about the money Daniel had taken from our joint account. I thought about how my father had shaken his hand at our engagement dinner. I thought about every holiday, every birthday, every family dinner where Daniel had sat at the center of my parents' attention like a planet with its own gravitational pull. I thought about the fact that I had always been, in my parents' house, the child who needed less. My sister Maya, 2 years older, louder, more fragile in the ways my parents understood, had always occupied the center. I was the one who was fine, the one who managed, the one who didn't require intervention. My parents had built an identity around not worrying about me, and then I had disrupted that. I had left a marriage they approved of. I had made their son-in-law an enemy. I had forced them to choose, and they had chosen the version of reality that required the least revision. The hearing lasted 2 days. My mother testified first. She described, in measured and careful language, 3 specific incidents. A time she arrived at my apartment unannounced and found Elliot eating cereal at 7 p.m. because I hadn't cooked dinner. A birthday party where she claimed I snapped at Elliot in front of other children. A phone call during which she said I had told her I couldn't do this anymore. Each incident was real. Each one had a context she omitted entirely. The cereal dinner was the night my car had broken down, and I had spent 4 hours arranging a tow truck and a rental and picking Elliot up from daycare an hour late. And when we got home, he had asked for cereal, and I gave him cereal because he was 4 years old and it was 7 p.m., and he was hungry, and I was a human being having a hard day. The birthday party outburst was the moment I asked Elliot, quietly, to please stop hitting his cousin with a foam sword after the 3rd time. My mother had described this as me losing control. The phone call, "I can't do this anymore," had been about my job. I had been talking about a difficult project at work. She knew that. She had been on the phone. She had heard the entire conversation. She left all of that out. My father testified briefly. He was less rehearsed than my mother, less precise. He said I seemed overwhelmed and not myself. When Sandra cross-examined him and asked him to provide specific examples, he mentioned the car breakdown incident, which my mother had already described, and then fell quiet. "Is that the primary basis for your concern, Mr. Harmon?" Sandra asked. "We just think Elliot needs more stability than Claire can give right now," he said. "And in your opinion, Mr. Alderton, your daughter's ex-husband who is seeking full custody, provides that stability?" My father looked at his hands. "Daniel has more resources." I wrote the word resources in the margin of my legal pad and underlined it 3 times. Daniel testified for 90 minutes. He was polished and precise and moved the courtroom through a narrative he had clearly been constructing for months. A story about a mother who was loving but overwhelmed, well-intentioned but inconsistent. A woman who needed support that she was unfortunately too proud to accept. He never raised his voice. He referred to me by my first name throughout, with the specific brand of concerned distance you use for someone you feel sorry for. I testified for 40 minutes. I was honest. I was calm. Sandra had coached me well. It didn't matter. The judge granted Daniel temporary primary custody pending a full evaluation. I was awarded 1 supervised hour per week. 1 hour. I remember standing in the hallway outside the courtroom after the ruling, watching my parents walk past me toward the elevators. My mother paused. She reached out and briefly touched my arm. "This will be better for Elliot," she said. I looked at her hand on my arm. "Don't," I said. She withdrew her hand. They got in the elevator. The doors closed. I stood in that hallway for a long time. 1 supervised hour per week with my son. 60 minutes every Saturday at a family services center in a room with beige walls and plastic chairs, and a social worker named Kevin who sat in the corner taking notes on a clipboard. Kevin was professionally kind and impeccably neutral in the way that people are when their job requires them to watch grief up close without reacting to it. Elliot was 5 years old. He didn't understand the room or the clipboard or why we couldn't leave together when the hour was up. The first Saturday, he cried when Kevin told him it was time. He wrapped both arms around my neck and said, "Mama, come home with me," and I held him and said, "Soon, baby, I promise soon." And Kevin wrote something on his clipboard, and I wanted to throw that clipboard through the window. I didn't. I smiled at Elliot, and I told him I loved him more than every star, and I watched him walk out the door with Daniel's assistant, a woman named Grace who had been hired specifically to do pickups and drop-offs so Daniel wouldn't have to see me. Then I drove to the parking lot of a hardware store 3 blocks away, and I sat in my car for 40 minutes. I did that most Saturdays for the first 2 months. Here is what nobody tells you about being restricted to 1 supervised hour per week with your child. The hours outside that hour become both unbearable and clarifying. You have nothing but time to think, and I used every minute of it. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Donna Park, and she had the direct, unsentimental manner of someone who had seen enough human behavior to be past shock but not past caring. She charged $85 an hour, and she was worth every cent. I started quietly rebuilding my documentation. Every interaction I had with Daniel, every text, every email, every curt exchange at the Family Services Center parking lot, I logged. Every time he was late for an exchange, every unanswered message about Elliot's school. I reached out to Elliot's kindergarten teacher, a warm woman named Ms. Flores, who had known Elliot since he was 3. She had seen us together. She had watched me volunteer at classroom events, show up for every conference, pack notes in his lunch. She agreed to write a letter. I got letters from Elliot's pediatrician, from the parents of his 2 closest friends, from my neighbor, a retired nurse named Mrs. Okafor, who had watched Elliot on emergency afternoons and eaten dinner with us enough times to speak to what our home looked like from the inside. I was building a case with the concentration of someone who has nothing left to lose except the one thing they cannot lose. But here's the thing about a custody case. You can have a mountain of character witnesses and what can feel like bulletproof documentation and still be fighting uphill if the other side has a coordinated story and the judge has not yet seen a reason to question it. Family court moves slowly. Evaluations take months. Hearings get rescheduled. The system is not designed for urgency, and it grinds you down in ways you don't anticipate. The Wednesday calls were the worst part. Daniel and I had agreed, through our attorneys, on a phone call schedule. I could call Elliot every Wednesday at 6 p.m. For the first month, the calls happened. Elliot would answer, and we'd talk about kindergarten and what he'd eaten for lunch and whether his shoes still fit. The ordinary, sacred inventory of a child's life that I was being rationed like medicine. Then in February, the calls started getting shorter. Elliot seemed distracted, distant in the specific way children are when they've been told something confusing by an adult and are trying to reconcile it with what they know. I asked him once if everything was okay, and he said, "Daddy says you're really busy," and I went very still on the other end of the phone. "I'm not busy, baby," I said. "I will always answer when you call. You know that, right?" "Yeah," he said, but he didn't sound sure. In March, a Wednesday call went unanswered entirely. I called 3 times. I sent 2 texts to Daniel's phone asking him to have Elliot call me back. He responded 4 hours later. Elliot was tired. He went to bed early. I forwarded the exchange to Sandra. She noted it. There were 12 more instances like that over the following 2 months. Each one documented. Each one forwarded to Sandra. Each one logged in the running record I maintained in a plain notebook I kept in my nightstand, the same one I'd started during the marriage. I had also, by that point, begun to hear things through the network of people who still told me things. Ms. Flores, Mrs. Okafor, a mutual friend of mine and Daniel's named Priya, who was careful about what she said, but not careful enough to say nothing. I heard that my mother was attending Elliot's weekend soccer games, something she had never done when Elliot lived primarily with me. I heard that Daniel had introduced my mother to his new girlfriend, a woman named Stephanie who had, according to Priya, been in the picture for considerably longer than the divorce proceedings would suggest. I heard that my father had been helping Daniel with home improvements, a deck, a fence. My father, who had not picked up a hammer for my apartment in 3 years of knowing my address. I wrote all of it down. I didn't know what to do with it yet, but I wrote it down. 4 months in, I was exhausted in a way that had no bottom. I was working reduced hours at the firm because I couldn't concentrate. I was sleeping badly. I had lost 11 pounds without trying. My doctor told me at a checkup that my blood pressure was elevated and asked if I was under stress, and I almost laughed. Sandra told me the full evaluation was scheduled for the spring and that we were well positioned. I was seeing my son for 1 hour a week. I want you to understand what 1 hour a week looks like from the inside. I want you to understand it because I think most people hear one supervised hour and picture something bearable, something manageable, an inconvenience. It is not an inconvenience. It is 60 minutes in a beige room, and you spend the first 5 of them watching your child adjust to the strangeness of the space, and the last 5 watching the clock because your child has started watching the clock too, has started understanding that there is an ending coming, and that the ending means separation, and you use the 50 minutes in the middle to be the most present, most calm, most patient version of yourself that you have ever been in your life. Not because it's easy, but because you know this is all you have, and you will not waste a second of it on your own grief. And then it ends. And you drive to a parking lot 3 blocks away, and you sit there. And the next Saturday is 6 days away. I didn't know that 60 miles away, in the house where Daniel had recently moved Elliot into his 3rd bedroom in 18 months, a detail I had flagged in my documentation, the constant moving, the instability he had claimed I represented. My 9-year-old son had found an old iPad in a kitchen drawer and had started pressing record. I found out about the video on a Thursday in April. Sandra called me at 8 a.m. She told me to come to her office immediately and to bring nothing except myself. When I got there, she turned her laptop around and pressed play. The video was 43 minutes long. Elliot had recorded it in 3 separate segments over 2 evenings, propping the iPad against a stack of books on the kitchen counter, partially hidden behind a fruit bowl. The quality wasn't perfect. The angle was slightly low, but the audio was clear. In the first segment, you could see Daniel's back and the side of his face as he stood at the counter reading something on his phone. Elliot asked if he could call me. Daniel said without looking up, "Your mom is busy. She told me she'd call when she has time." Elliot said, "She always calls on Wednesdays." Daniel said, "I know, buddy. She's just been really busy lately." I always called on Wednesdays. Daniel had been telling Elliot I wasn't calling. In the second segment, my mother was there. She and Daniel were sitting at the kitchen table after what appeared to be dinner. Elliot had gone to get a glass of water. They didn't know he was in the hallway. They didn't know the iPad was recording. My mother said, "Is the evaluation still in May?" Daniel said, "Sandra's pushing for April. The sooner the better at this point." My mother said, "We should make sure the evaluator speaks to Ruth." Ruth was Daniel's sister, a woman who had met Elliot perhaps 4 times in his life. Daniel said, "Already on the list. I need you to be consistent about the dinner incident when she asks. The same version as the hearing." My mother said, "Of course." 3 words. Of course. Like they were confirming a restaurant reservation, like they were coordinating a birthday surprise. My mother sat at my ex-husband's kitchen table and agreed to repeat a coordinated version of events to a custody evaluator and said, of course, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I watched that segment 4 times in Sandra's office. I watched it with the specific stillness that happens when something you feared was true is confirmed, and your body doesn't know whether to collapse or calcify. The 3rd segment was the shortest. It was just Elliot, alone in what I recognized as his bedroom, talking directly into the camera in a low voice, like he was afraid someone would hear. "This is for my mom," he said. "Dad keeps saying you're busy, but I know you're not busy because you always call on Wednesdays and you didn't call, and I think Dad told you not to. Grandma was here and she told Dad to say the same thing as before, and I don't know what that means, but I don't think it's true. I love you, Mama. I hope you see this." Sandra had to pause the video. We sat in her office for a moment without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "I'm filing for an emergency hearing today." I need to stop right here for a second. If you are watching this and you have a child, if you have ever sat in a beige room with a clipboard in the corner and counted every minute of 60, you know exactly what it felt like to watch that video. And if you're watching this and you recognize something in my mother's voice, in that, of course, in the smooth coordination of it, drop a comment. Because I know I'm not the only one. Subscribe if you haven't. The next part is the hearing, and I need you to see what happened when that judge pressed play. The emergency hearing was called for April 28th, 10 days after Sandra filed. In those 10 days, I did not contact my parents. I did not contact Daniel. I went to my supervised Saturday hour and I held Elliot and I told him about a book I was reading, and we built a marble run out of cardboard tubes that Kevin had helpfully provided. And when Elliot asked me if things were going to get better, I said yes, with more certainty than I had felt in 6 months, because for the first time since November, I had something solid beneath my feet. The courtroom was smaller than the one from the first hearing. Judge Patricia Osei. Not the same judge, I learned, because the original judge had recused himself over a scheduling conflict that Sandra described to me with a tone that suggested she considered this a favorable development. Judge Osei was in her late 50s. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had the unhurried manner of someone who has learned that patience, applied with precision, is more effective than urgency. Daniel arrived with Marcus Webb. My parents arrived separately. My mother was wearing a gray blazer I recognized from the original hearing. The same one, I noticed, which struck me as either coincidence or habit. Sandra presented the video to the court. Judge Osei watched all 43 minutes. The courtroom was very quiet during the screening. I watched Daniel. I watched his posture change during the second segment, the slight rigidity that entered his shoulders when he heard his own voice say, the same version as before. I watched him lean toward Marcus Webb and say something in a low voice. Marcus Webb wrote something on a legal pad. My mother watched the screen with her hands folded in her lap. When her own voice said, "Of course," she closed her eyes briefly. When the video ended, Judge Osei took off her reading glasses and set them on the bench in front of her. She looked at Marcus Webb. "Counsel," she said, "I have some questions about communication, patterns between your client and the minor child." What followed was an hour and 40 minutes of testimony and cross-examination that I will not reconstruct in full because some of it is still part of an ongoing legal record. What I will tell you is this. Marcus Webb was a skilled attorney. He argued that the video was taken without consent, that a child's perception of events was not reliable evidence, that the interaction captured in the second segment was susceptible to multiple interpretations. Judge Osei listened to all of it. Then she asked my father, who had been sitting in the gallery and was called to the stand unexpectedly, whether he had been present for any conversations about coordinating testimony. My father is not a skilled liar. He never has been. He operates through omission and deference. He lets my mother speak, and he agrees. Put him alone on a witness stand in front of a judge who is looking at him with the patient, precise attention of someone who has heard every variation of this story before, and he doesn't have the machinery to maintain a fiction. He said he hadn't been part of any conversations. Then Judge Osei asked him specifically about a dinner at Daniel's house in February, where the upcoming evaluation had been discussed. My father's pause was 4 seconds long. Then he said, "I may have been present for parts of that." Marcus Webb objected. Judge Osei noted the objection and continued. She asked my mother the same question. My mother said, "I don't recall the specifics of every conversation." "Mrs. Harmon," Judge Osei said, with a quietness that was more authoritative than volume, "I've just watched a video in which your voice is clearly audible agreeing to repeat a specific version of events to a custody evaluator. I would encourage you to think carefully before answering." The room was absolutely still. My mother looked at her hands. Then she looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at the table. "We were trying to do what was best for Elliot," she said. It wasn't a denial. Judge Osei issued an emergency modification that same day. Effective immediately, primary custody was restored to me. Daniel was granted alternating weekends pending the full evaluation. The same evaluation that was now going to proceed under significantly different circumstances, with significantly different questions about Daniel's conduct and my parents' involvement in the custody proceedings. The supervised hour was over. I picked Elliot up that afternoon from Daniel's house, not from the Family Services Center, not from a parking lot handoff, but from the front door, where I rang the bell and Grace opened it, and Elliot was right there in the hallway with his backpack on, like he'd been waiting. He ran at me so hard we both nearly fell over. I held him in that doorway for a long time. I could hear Grace retreating somewhere inside the house. I didn't care about anything in that doorway except the weight of him and the smell of his hair and the fact that we were going home. "I saw the video, baby," I told him. He pulled back and looked at me. Did it help? It helped so much. He thought about this. "I wasn't supposed to use the iPad without asking," he said. "You're not in trouble," I said. "Okay," he said, and he picked up his backpack and took my hand, and we walked to the car. Here is what happened in the months that followed. The full custody evaluation concluded in July. The evaluator, a forensic psychologist named Dr. Miriam Chen, submitted a 67-page report. I haven't read all of it. Sandra summarized the relevant findings. No evidence of instability or unfitness on my part. Documented concerns about Daniel's communication practices with Elliot and his pattern of relocation, and a recommendation for primary residence with me, with structured visitation for Daniel. The final custody order was issued in September. It followed Dr. Chen's recommendation. My parents were not called as witnesses again. My mother called me in August. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was 2 minutes and 14 seconds long. I know because I listened to it once and then looked at the timestamp. She said she was sorry. She said she had been wrong. She said she had convinced herself she was acting in Elliot's interests, and she understood now that she hadn't been. She said she missed me. I didn't call back. Not in August, not in September. In October, my father showed up at my door. He hadn't called ahead. He stood on my porch in his jacket with his hands in his pockets, looking at the welcome mat. When I opened the door, he didn't launch into a speech. He didn't have a prepared statement. He just looked at me and said, "I don't know how to fix this, but I wanted to come and say I know what I did." I looked at my father for a long moment. "I know you do, Dad," I said. I didn't invite him in, but I didn't close the door in his face either. We stood there for a few minutes and talked. About Elliot, about nothing important, about the kind of ordinary things you say when you're standing in the wreckage of something and you're not yet sure if there's anything worth rebuilding. He left after 20 minutes. He said he'd come back whenever I was ready. I haven't decided if I'm ready. I'm not sure the timeline is something I can map from the outside. I've thought a lot in the months since about what it takes for a person to do what my parents did, not the mechanics of it. I understand the mechanics. I understand that Daniel is persuasive and that my parents needed a narrative that didn't require them to feel guilty about choosing him, and that the narrative he gave them was carefully constructed to be exactly that. I understand the psychology of motivated belief, the way people find the evidence that supports what they've already decided to feel. What I've been trying to understand is something more specific. My mother sat at a kitchen table with my ex-husband and agreed, in 3 quiet syllables, to repeat a coordinated story to a professional whose job was to determine the welfare of my child. And she did it without apparent conflict, without visible hesitation. She said, "Of course," the way you say "of course" to a question that has an obvious answer. I keep asking myself what she told herself in the moment, what the internal monologue was, whether she believed she was doing right by Elliot or whether she had simply arrived at a place where the cost of reversing course was higher than the cost of continuing, whether, of course, was conviction or momentum. I don't know. I may never know. My mother is not a woman who examines her own interior life in front of other people, and she is not going to start now. What I know is that the choice she made, the one captured on 43 minutes of shaky iPad footage, will be part of the record of my family's history for as long as any of us are around to remember it. The truth of what happened cannot be unwitnessed, and I know that my son, who was 9 years old and sleeping in his 3rd bedroom in 18 months and missing his Wednesday phone calls, decided on his own, with an old iPad and a fruit bowl and whatever instinct children have for when something is wrong. He decided that the truth needed a witness. I think about that a lot. I think about the specific bravery of it, not dramatic bravery. He wasn't afraid of anything physical, wasn't risking anything except getting in trouble for using the iPad, but the bravery of a child who knows something is being hidden and decides to uncover it anyway. The bravery of someone who doesn't yet know the word evidence, but understands the concept perfectly. He got in no trouble for the iPad. I want to be clear about that. He did ask me, about a week after we came home, whether Grandma and Grandpa were going to come over anymore. He asked it in a neutral tone, the way children ask about things they've already partly processed, testing the emotional temperature. I told him the truth in the way you tell a child the truth. Not all of it at once, not more than he was ready for. I told him that Grandma and Grandpa had made some choices that had been hard for our family, and that we were going to take some time, and that none of it was his fault or anything to worry about. He thought about this. "Are they sorry?" he asked. "I think so, yes." "Is sorry enough?" I looked at him for a moment. 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of orange juice, asking the question that adults spend entire lifetimes not knowing how to answer. "I don't know yet," I said. "Sometimes it is, and sometimes it takes more than sorry. We'll figure it out." He seemed to accept this. He drank his orange juice. He asked if we were having pasta for dinner. We had pasta for dinner, and that, more than anything, more than the courtroom, more than the ruling, more than any of it. That is what I want to hold on to. The pasta dinner, the glass of orange juice, the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being in my own kitchen with my son, asking about dinner like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because it is. It's the most natural thing in the world. And for 6 months, it was taken from me by people who should have protected it. I'm not going to let myself forget that. But I'm also not going to let it be the only thing. I haven't decided if I'm ready. I'm not sure the timeline is something I can map from the outside. What I know is this. My mother sat at a table and agreed to coordinate testimony against me and said, "Of course," like it cost her nothing. And my father sat on a witness stand and paused for 4 seconds before choosing the partial truth over the full one. And those two things happened, and they are in the record, and I cannot unfind them. What I also know is that a 9-year-old boy found a kitchen drawer with an old iPad in it and decided in his small and certain way that his mother needed to see something. Elliot doesn't fully understand what he did. He knows he helped. He knows things are different now. He asks me sometimes if I'm happy, with the directness that children have before they learn to be more careful about direct questions. I tell him yes, and it's true, in the way that things can be true after they've been broken and put back together. Not the same shape, not the same weight, but real, solid, mine. I'm not going to stand here and give you a clean ending, because this isn't a clean story, and I don't think you came here for a clean story. My divorce is final. My son sleeps in his room 4 nights a week, and his father's house 3 nights, and he has, with the remarkable adaptability of children, figured out how to carry both homes inside him. Daniel and I communicate by email. We have not had a real conversation in almost a year. Sometimes I see him at Elliot's school events, and we nod and occupy separate corners, and that is, for now, the best we can do. My parents are in a place I don't have a word for yet. Not estranged, not reconciled. Something in between. The complicated geography of people who hurt you badly and know it and are waiting to find out if knowing it is enough. I don't know if it is. That's the truth. What I do know, what I want you to take from this if you take anything, is that the systems we trust to protect us sometimes fail. The people we trust to stand behind us sometimes don't. And when that happens, you are left with a choice. You can wait for someone to validate what you know is true, or you can build the kind of evidence that makes the truth impossible to ignore. I built it. And a 9-year-old boy who learned somewhere that when something is wrong, you don't look away from it. He built it too. We are both, I think, our mother's children after all. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. If you've been through something like this, a custody battle, a family that chose sides, a moment where the people who were supposed to protect you turned around, I want you to know I see you. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, the next video is linked right below. I'll see you there.